Hello, everyone. Today's topic will be the chemical foundations of life. As discussed last time, one of the characteristics shared by all living organisms is order. Order is required for the structure and function of cells from molecules to their organization into tissues that make up organs, which lead to organ systems of bodies. We can see here how order builds upon itself a hierarchy of complexity. To understand this order, we must understand the macromolecules that are its foundation, and to do that, we must first review the chemistry involved. Of course, we're all made up of matter. This matter occupies space and has mass. Our matter, like the image to the right, is a collection of atoms and their associations to what are called molecules. One thing Many of you have seen this basic interpretation of the atom. In the center, we have what is called the nucleus, and enveloping the nucleus are different orbitals. These concepts were established quite a long time ago through experimental evidence, and it wasn't until 2013 where scientists were able to observe the first atom. Here we can see the hydrogen atom with the nucleus in the center and the electron orbital surrounding it. An atom can be broken down into three subatomic particles: the proton, neutron, and electron. The neutrons, as their name implies, have no charge, while the protons have a positive charge. Electrons are located in orbital around the nucleus and have a negative charge. Protons and neutrons both weigh the same amount, 1 Dalton. The mass of an electron is so small that it doesn't matter. The atomic mass is equal to the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. So checkpoint 1 is: what is the mass of the atom at the right? 12 Daltons, 6 Daltons, 24 Daltons, or 36 Daltons? Be sure to write down the letter associated with the number to answer your checkpoint questions on Blackboard. And here's a summary of the subatomic particles traits. The proton has a mass of 1 and a charge of +1. The neutron also has a mass of 1 but a charge of 0. We'll discuss later, but neutrons determine the isotope of the element. And then finally, electrons. Electrons have a mass of 0 for all intents and purposes and a charge of -1. And electrons will determine the ion, as we'll discuss. Okay, now let's discuss how atoms are categorized into the elements. The elements are all of the different atoms that you may be familiar with. What makes gold gold or oxygen oxygen isn't the number of neutrons or number of electrons. Instead, it is the number of protons. We'll learn later that there is a range of electrons and neutrons an element can have, but each has an exact number of protons. To the right is the periodic table of the elements. In the top right of the chart is hydrogen, which is defined as having a single proton. Above the symbol of hydrogen, you'll see a corresponding number 1 representing the number of protons it has. The periodic table of elements lists all of the elements in order of ascending number of protons, from right to left and top to bottom. Taken from the table is carbon, denoted by the letter C. At the top of every element is the number of protons, called the atomic number. At the bottom is the atomic weight. The atomic weight takes the average of the atom's mass of an element as found on Earth. Now, although the number of protons is always 6 for carbon, the number of neutrons can vary. And that is why you have to take the average of the carbons on Earth to find the atomic weight. The most common number of neutrons is 6 for carbon, but sometimes there are more. and therefore the average mass of carbon is 12.01. And here again, we have a representation of the periodic table of the elements. Of special note here are the um, 25 elements that comprise living organisms. As we'll cover later, there are 4 biomolecules of life, and these biomolecules are going to be entirely made up of the orange elements seen in this table: hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. And these 4 elements compose 96.3% of the mass of living cells. As discussed, a given element, like carbon, can vary in the number of neutrons they possess. So what do we call them, and how do we take them into consideration? Atoms of the same element that have different numbers of neutrons and therefore masses are called isotopes. Here we see carbon-12 has 6 neutrons and 6 protons, giving it an atomic mass of 12. Carbon-13 has 7 neutrons, and carbon-14 has 8 neutrons, giving it an atomic mass of 14. The atomic weight is the average of all isotopes and their relative abundance. Again, the atomic weight for carbon is 12.01, 12.011 if you extend it out an extra digit. And this is because most of it is carbon-12, 98.93%, and carbon-13, although it weighs 13 for its atomic mass, it's only 1.07%. So it only slightly raises that atomic weight. And carbon-14 does exist, but there's very little of it. And so it has a weighted effect of very little on the atomic weight. Here again is nitrogen. Nitrogen has 7 protons. Its atomic weight is 14.007, and that's because there's also a nitrogen 14 and a nitrogen 15, and most of it is found as nitrogen 14, and almost none is found as nitrogen 13, so it does not really shift the balance there. Point 2, how many protons are in the nucleus of a magnesium ion? Or sorry, a magnesium atom. Point 3, the 3 stable isotopes of magnesium are shown in the table at the right. How many neutrons does isotope magnesium 26 have in its nucleus? Electrons are another subatomic particle of atoms that can vary for a specific element. If there are the same number of electrons as protons, their charges cancel each other out, and the element is said to be neutral. If there are less electrons than protons, then the element has a positive charge. And if more, then it is said to have a negative charge. These charged particles are called ions. Here we have a fluorine atom with an equal number of electrons attracted to the nucleus of 9 protons. However, if one or more electron joins an orbital, we have 10 negatively charged electrons and still only 9 positively charged protons. The sum, called a charge of this ion, is therefore -1. A special note is that electrons may change through the course of regular chemical reactions, but protons and neutrons of a specific atom are much more difficult to alter and are not affected by normal interactions between atoms. There are 2 types of ions: cations, which have more protons than electrons and are therefore positively charged, and the anions, which have more electrons than protons and are therefore negatively charged. Taking a look at the ion on the right side of the screen, can you determine if this is a cation or anion? The answer is that this is an anion because the protons are outnumbered by the electron by 1, and electrons have a negative charge, making it an anion. Checkpoint 4. Atoms of the same element all have the same number of blank, while blank and blank may vary. Checkpoint 5. Carbon may have a mass of 12, 13, or 14. These all represent different blank of carbon. The difference in their masses is due to the different numbers of blank located in the blank. And checkpoint 6. Ions of magnesium usually have a charge of +2. How many electrons are in this magnesium ion? Electrons are held within their orbitals by their attraction to the proton's charge. These orbitals exist in different distances from the nucleus and therefore at different strengths. Which one would you assume are held most tightly by the nucleus? The inner orbital electrons or the outer orbital electrons? The answer is the inner ones, analogous to how gravity has a stronger attraction to those items that are closer to a given object like the Earth, or magnets pull on one another is greater the closer they are, so are electrons. And this will become critical in the ability of elements to react chemically with one another. Furthest orbital is called the valence, or sometimes the outermost shell. These electrons are the least stable and therefore reactive. How many valence electrons are in a potassium atom? Here we can see potassium represented as K as having one electron in the outermost shell, or valence. And how many valence electrons are in a phosphorus atom, represented by P? And here you should have said 5 electrons. Generally speaking, atoms are not stable when they do not have 8 valence electrons. Consequently, these electrons like to associate with other atoms to fill the outermost orbital. In doing so, groups of atoms or ions form molecules and react with one another. The process of forming molecules is the exchange or sharing of electrons between atoms. This is what scientists mean by a chemical bond between atoms. Just like holding two pairs of hands is stronger than holding one pair of hands, the more the number of electrons that are shared, the stronger the bond. In this example, nitrogen has 5 valence electrons. By sharing 3 of its electrons with another nitrogen, each now has 5 plus 3, or 8 electrons in their outermost shell. This is the most common form of nitrogen in our atmosphere, and the reason is because once it is formed, it is very difficult to break those triple bonds to make other molecules with nitrogen. This is the reason that nitrogen is such a common and important fertilizer. It's one of the elements in the 4 biomolecules of life, but it is very hard to separate from itself to make biomolecules with it. So it's often a limiting nutrient for plants and soils. Bonds can be generally categorized into 2 types. Ionic bonds are formed through the actual exchange of an electron, where one donates their electron to another. They occur between 2 types of elements, a nonmetal and a metal element. Here, the metal sodium, denoted by Na, donates one of its electrons to chlorine, Cl. And the result is that the orbital underneath now becomes the outermost orbital. And if we count the number of electrons, we'll find that there are 8 there. Chlorine, in accepting the electron, adds to its existing 7 valence electrons to make 8 electrons. Here's a visual representation of metals and nonmetals on the periodic table of the elements. Memorizing all of these would be a difficult task, but if you can be familiar with the interface of where metals transition into metal-like atoms, note the bold line that separates the blue from the green-colored elements, and then the non-metal elements. To us, it's important to recognize that hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen are all nonmetals. So when these nonmetal elements react with each other, they would not be considered ionic bonds. I'd like to point out that on the left, all but hydrogen are metallic, and on the right, all are nonmetallic elements. Look carefully for sodium, abbreviated Na. You'll find it on the third row on the far left. Additionally, if you seek out chlorine, abbreviated Cl, on the third row on the right side, you can see that Na is a metal and Cl is a nonmetal. So when these two elements react with each other, we can assume that we're going to be forming an ionic bond. And as we showed earlier, in this reaction where sodium and chlorine interact to form NaCl, commonly known as table salt, one electron is donated from sodium to chlorine, and it becomes positively charged and has 8 valence electrons. And chlorine then becomes negatively charged and also has 8 valence electrons. Covalent bonds are bonds where electrons are not donated but shared with each other. The prefix co is Latin for jointly or together. Shared bonds are interesting because they get counted for both atoms. So in the two nonmetallic hydrogens, each having a single electron alone, when in a covalent bond, are considered to each have 2 valence electrons. Hydrogen is unique in that it doesn't have enough protons to balance out 8 electrons, and it is therefore satisfied with just 2 electrons in its valence. Note how each of the previous examples of covalent bonds takes place between nonmetal elements alone. And so we can automatically assume we're talking about covalent bonds, not ionic bonds. Here's another example of a covalent bond. We discussed earlier, nitrogen can bond with another nitrogen. Nitrogen has 5 valent electrons present, and if each one of those nitrogen atoms shares its electron with the other, so in the center, imagine now there are 6 electrons there being shared, that the total of each nitrogen atom, if we count those shared electrons for each nitrogen, is going to be 8. Point 7. Which of the bonds seen in each of the compounds below are ionic or covalent? And here we have water, magnesium sulfate, and methane. And please feel free to refer back to the periodic table of elements to confirm your answers. So far, the images we have shown have not captured another component of these bonds, and that is electronegativity. Depending on the atoms involved in a covalent bond, electrons aren't equally shared. The distribution of the shared electrons depends on the atom's strength of attraction to the electrons. This is called their electronegativity. So electronegativity is a measurement of an atom's affinity for electrons. You can see here that there is a general trend where the further to the right and to the top you move, the stronger the electronegativity of an atom. The electronegativity in the periodic table of elements here is represented in the big blue numbers. So fluorine, of all the atoms shown, has the strongest electronegativity and the biggest pull for electrons to its atom. So you would imagine that if fluorine was to, say, interact with lithium, which you can find on the second row, lithium on the far right, or sorry, far left, and fluorine on the far right, that fluorine would very tightly hold on to the electrons that are being shared. In this example, we show hydrogen fluoride, okay? And we have two bonded atoms with very different electronegativities, and they don't share their electrons equally. And so we can imagine here that electrons are going to have a higher probability of being found around the fluorine than around the hydrogen. And what we call this bond is we call it a polar bond because it's more polarized towards the fluorine than on the hydrogen. This here is a nonpolar covalent bond. So we see hydrogen, and the B denotes boron. And these two atoms have a fairly similar electronegativity, and therefore the electrons are pretty evenly distributed across these two atoms. And that's what makes this covalent bond called a nonpolar covalent bond. So we have the polar bonds and dipoles. In polar covalent bonds, one end of the molecule gains a slight positive charge because it's a little less deficient, or it's a little more deficient in the electrons. It's a little lacking in the time that the electrons spend on its side of the molecule, while the other side gains a slight negative charge. And these are the bipoles. So more electrons equals a greater negative charge, and the fewer the electrons is a more of a positive charge. And that's what we mean when we say the dipoles. And this is just to take a look at how these dipoles play out. And what happens is these individual molecules can be attracted to each other's dipoles. So the fluorine, because it's electron rich, may be attracted to another hydrogen fluoride molecule to its hydrogen side of that molecule. Whereas hydrogen boride doesn't really attract one another because there's not that dipole uh, asymmetric distribution of the electrons. So here are the three worst sharers. There are three pairs of atoms that result in extremely unequal electron sharing when they are covalently bonded. One is hydrogen fluoride. Two is hydrogen and oxygen bonds. And this will become very important soon enough. And three is hydrogen and nitrogen bonds. Okay, so as we discussed earlier, molecules that have a strong dipole moment can be attracted to each other. And in these three pairs, positive and negative ends are so strong that separate molecules are highly attracted to each other. The attraction between molecules is called a hydrogen bond. Here's this extra bond here we're denoting with the green dashes between the hydrogen of one molecule and the fluorine of another. Compounds that include at least one of these three pairs of atoms form hydrogen bonds between separate molecules. In this example, we have ammonia, which is NH3, and the negative nitrogen atom of one molecule hydrogen bonds to the positive hydrogen atom of another molecule. And here we go. Point 8. Which of the following molecules is capable of hydrogen bonding? And this brings us to the most important hydrogen bonding molecule of them all. A molecule of water is H2O, meaning that it is made of two hydrogens that are covalently bonded to and sharing their electrons with an oxygen atom. However, they are not sharing their electrons equally because oxygen is very greedy with its electrons and hydrogen is not. Oxygen pulls the shared electrons toward itself, making that end of the molecule more negative and leaving the hydrogens more positive. Consequently, when you get lots of water molecules together, the oxygen molecules of one water will hydrogen bond with the hydrogen molecules of another water molecule. And this makes a very concentrated solution because the hydrogen bonding brings them very close together. And this is what makes water so dense. So much so that when you create solid water or ice, which forms a crystal lattice, here we can see the ice hydrogen bonds that are very stable and have a very symmetric shape to them, the ice becomes less dense than the liquid water. And consequently, that is why ice floats. This is an incredible property of ice, of water, because as a consequence of this, our lakes don't freeze from the bottom up. Instead, you get a nice ice layer on the top, and the liquid water on the bottom is insulated from the atmosphere and can stay liquid for longer. Another special property of water is that it resists change in temperature. So it tends to not easily boil away or freeze. It tends to maintain a state for a longer period of time. So it resists a change in state. So it can resist going from a solid to a liquid and a liquid to a gas. And so we can maintain liquid water in a lot more greater circumstances than maybe other liquids that don't have such a powerful hydrogen bonding ability. And a reason for that is because the hydrogen molecules are pulling on each other so tightly that it takes much more energy to get them to break free of one another and escape as a gas form. Also, because water is so polar, it means that it can dissolve molecules much more easily. So if we think of salt, right, as this think of it as a solid compound containing Na or sodium and Cl or chlorine, and they are ionic bonds. Remember, we have a positive charge and a negative charge. That positive charged sodium can very easily end up sticking to an oxygen, which is again negatively charged, and be pulled away from that solid. And additionally, the chlorine, which is more negatively charged because it had an electron donated to it, can be lifted off by the hydrogens of the water. And that increases the ability of water to dissolve ionic compounds or polar molecules. Okay. All right, so now let's go over the special properties of water number 5, and that is nonpolar or hydrophobic molecules do not dissolve in water. So we have molecules that do not have very good charges on them, as you may recall. Some have pretty close electronegativities to one another, so they share electrons very evenly. And one such compound are oils. And so we see that oils, because they are very neutral in their charge, they repel the charges of the water and they separate. So the hydrophobic effect describes the tendency of nonpolar molecules to avoid water because they cannot dissolve in it. And this is very important when we start delving into the different components, the structure of cells. Surrounding every cell for animals is going to be a phospholipid bilayer. And these are fats or oils here that we'll talk about more. Um, they're called phospholipids. Okay. And these phospholipids, they have a polar head and nonpolar tails. We'll get into the detail later on about what a polar head and nonpolar tail is made of at the atomic level. But essentially, you need to be aware that the polar head has what we call a phosphate group on it. It has oxygens, and that makes it negatively charged. The nonpolar tails are hydrocarbons. They don't have much of a charge to them, and because they're not very polar, they're very neutral. They repel water. So if you look at the image on the right, you can see that the polar head faces towards the water on both the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell, and the tails naturally assimilate to face inwards. So this has the effect of being auto assimilated into the structure we see here. And this is how cell membranes are formed. Here we can see a close up. We have what's called the intracellular part of the cell. So that's the inner part of the cell. And then the part that faces the environment is the extracellular part. And because it's a phospholipid bilayer, we have these polar phosphate heads that face inwards and they face outwards. And then the tails, because they're neutral in their charge or non-polar, they face towards each other and therefore they don't have to face the water which repels them. Okay, checkpoint 6 or checkpoint 9. Choose one of water's special properties that result from hydrogen bonding and describe in detail how it is essential for living organisms. Another essential variable when it comes to the chemicals of life is that of pH, acids and bases. The pH scale is based on the amount of hydrogen ions, which are what we would call free protons, present in a solution. Remember that hydrogen has one proton and it has one electron. So an ion that is lacking its electron is essentially a free proton. The lower the concentration of hydrogen ions, the higher the pH. I know this is very confusing. Take some time there to really focus on this concept because it's going to come up again and again and again. But the lower the concentration of hydrogen ions, the higher the pH. Conversely, the more hydrogen ions, the lower the pH. So, therefore, you can think of it in another way in that hydrogen ions make something more acidic. And on the pH scale, acidity is lower in number, neutral is 7, and something that is basic is going to have a higher number than 7. So it- if we look at, say, gastric acid, it's going to be one of the more acidic things that we're going to find on the scale. So if you were to guess, does gastric acid have more protons or less protons than, say, tomato juice? You should say it has more protons or more hydrogen ions because it is more acidic. Okay, checkpoint 10. Which of the following best describes the difference between Dr. Pepper and bleach? And that concludes chapter 2. Thank you so much for joining in this lecture, and we'll see you during the next one.